Okay, so Maurice, one of the other things that I've been noticing is that in some ways, nonprofits are getting really very adept at nonprofit mergers. They've heard about them now for a number of years. And so when the issue comes up or when somebody thinks, let's look into this, they're really ready to go. In the past, we've been approached by nonprofits when they are just very, very in the early stages of thinking about some form of collaboration and don't even really want to talk about the word merger at first. And so it's just been an interesting, it's almost like everything has sort of accelerated. And we're finding, in some cases, we have clients coming to us who say, we partially already negotiated this, but we've hit sort of a roadblock and now we think we need some help. And I'm just curious if that's something that you're encountering, since I find it a little bit trickier to kind of jump in when negotiations are partway through. So curious what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, I think organizations are more familiar and more experienced with mergers today than they were 4 or 5 years ago in the nonprofit space. I think a lot of that has to do with board members who may have experienced mergers from their corporate perspective. We did see in the corporate side the highest number of transactions, I think, was in 2020, actually right after the pandemic. It took a dip, but then it went up in 2020 and 2021. And so there's been a lot of volume, whether that's the banking industry, whether that's the airline industry. I mean, there's been a lot of mergers taking place, and not just in corporate, but even in nonprofit. We've seen it for the longest time in healthcare. We've also seen it in higher education now. You're seeing a lot of universities consolidate. And so I think just the environment in general, we're seeing this take place all around us. And so it's not uncommon for communities to have, maybe United Ways that have come together or other organizations. And so when it's time for them to consider this, they're usually not the first in line in that community that's considered having these discussions. And, in some situations, that's been really helpful because they've had a model that they can look at, especially when you think about like a geographical footprint. Oftentimes there may be another organization who has expanded services into a new community that shares that geographical footprint. And so they kind of have something to model after. And so I do find that organizations have considered this. They've, in a lot of situations, been talking about it. And many times that can be good because it's an organic conversation. It's something that, they're already thinking about. They're looking to bring in a partner to help facilitate and move the discussion along in ways that they may not be familiar. They may not know what to cover in due diligence. And so they bring in, another consultant to kind of help facilitate that process. And, I think it is when you do come in and they've already had conversations, I think it's really key to kind of try to ascertain or assess what they've covered already, so you can pick up the ball where they left off. But more times than not, you're probably going to have to repeat some of the same questions that they've already gone through. So, just depends on the timing of where they're at. But overall, I see it as a good thing because I think, organizations that are already having these conversations organically are a lot more motivated to maybe move forward and encouraged to move forward versus if this was something that was presented to them. So I think it's a good thing, but it is a challenge trying to support them in due diligence to make sure that you're being smart with everybody's time and not, wasting time unnecessarily.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you that it's nice to be past those days where it was like a dirty word that, somehow if you were looking at merging, that was some kind of failure. I think folks recognize, just like in the private sector, that there are great reasons strategically to have scale, to, build a platform for growth. So it's great that that they are more comfortable having those conversations. I think it's interesting that you bring up the issue of corporate experience in nonprofit mergers, because I agree with you. I mean, it's helpful when folks have understand the benefits of the merger, but I have had some challenges where folks coming from the corporate sector are much more focused on the dollars and kind of want to know if it's an acquisition. And I just think in the nonprofit world, it's a whole different animal, and we don't even really use the term at La Piana acquisition, because we're not exchanging money here. And the other challenge that I find is that I think corporate mergers are more adversarial in a way, where two sides are both trying to get the best deal. And I think in the best practices, it's in the nonprofit world, you want to be focused on mission, and you want to see how can we be stronger together. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's not one person's going to win and one person's going to lose, but we're going to see how we can best fulfill this sort of new joint mission together. And so sometimes I have a hard time with folks who are bringing a corporate merger background to it, because they are looking at everything as, are we giving up anything, or what can we negotiate? And it's well, what's going to be best for this new mission of this combined entity? And in some ways you might win or lose, but that's not really the point anymore. And so it's just it's helpful. And then they have to kind of take off that hat a little bit and think about things sort of in a different paradigm, because I think the nonprofit merger is it's a different animal in some ways. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, no, totally. And, I think oftentimes when people just hear the word merger, their immediate reaction is what they see from the corporate sector, right? And in the corporate sector, it does a lot of times leave people feeling a little uneasy, because in the corporate sector, we got to remember it's about shareholder value. And in order to get to shareholder value, you got to increase margins. And so they're cutting costs. And so, oftentimes they're looking to cut costs. So that may mean closing facilities, that may mean removing duplicative services. And so to your point, in the nonprofit, it's all about mission. And so, oftentimes we're not looking to close down facilities or we're looking at efficiencies, but it's really driven by mission and not so much the bottom line. And what I tell people oftentimes in a nonprofit merger, you're probably actually going to wind up spending more money, because you need greater infrastructure, you need greater scale in order to deliver services. So you shouldn't be looking at mergers as a strategy for a cost reduction, but I think most nonprofit leaders recognize this as a strategy for growth, and they realize that in order to grow, they have to build out their infrastructure. And that's really what should be the motivation in the nonprofit merger is, in order for us to grow and to scale, we need greater infrastructure, and we're going to have to make an investment. And we can do that through this strategy. We can, maybe double our infrastructure overnight by working together with somebody, and versus trying to double that infrastructure on our own. And so they're able to have the infrastructure that's needed to offer services and scale services much faster than what they can do on their own. But your point around, the corporate understanding is spot on, because again, I think many people see, the big headlines in the news with a merger took place, and then they cut thousands of jobs, they closed down facilities, etc. And again, in nonprofits, they're actually looking to more times than not, add more jobs, pay better wages, improve the infrastructure so that they can scale, because many nonprofits are already super thin. So they can't really afford to cut a bunch of jobs, because, they're already thin and on expenses as it is. And so it's a little bit different in terms of the incentive and the motivation, but I think that's part of the education that we try to do, is try to help people understand the difference between mergers in the for-profit sector and mergers in the nonprofit sector, because they do look a lot different, and you have to think about them differently.
Yeah. And so interesting, I didn't realize that mergers had been on the upswing in the for-profit sector in 2020, 2021. That's really interesting.